All right, so our website is still looking a little bit sparse, and in fact, it's looking nothing like this, is it? But we're going to change that very, very quickly. Let's go ahead and add the rest of the content in order to have all the images that we need for our top section. Now, in this lesson, if you look at the resources, you'll find a zip file that you can download. And once you extract that zip file, you should now have a folder called CSS My Site Images. Now, if you double click on this folder, you'll see two images. One is a cloud and another is a mountain. And we're going to try and recreate the scene that they've got over here. So let's go ahead and add those images to our project folder. So if you pull up Atom, and find your project folder, then we're going to go and create a new folder in here called Images. And inside this Images folder is where we're going to drag and drop those two PNGs, the cloud and the mountain. So we're going to put it inside here so that we can use it inside our website. So now we're going to go ahead and add our images so that we have a image of a cloud at the top of our top container. So the source will be images/cloud.png, and the alt text will just be cloud image. And we're going to have another cloud below this paragraph tag. And finally, we're going to have an image of our mountain right at the bottom. So that will be images/mountain.png, and the alt text will just be mountain image. All right, let's hit save and let's refresh to see what our page looks like right now. Now, it looks a little bit weird, right? Why is it that this cloud is taking up its own line and it's not next to either this heading or this paragraph tag, but this cloud is on the same line and next to this mountain image? What is going on here? Well, to understand this, we have to look at the CSS display property. Now, the display property has 4 different values, and we're going to look at them in turn and see what each one of these does. Now, if we switch on pesticide again, you can see that the box around the cloud is only as large as the image, as is the box around the mountain and this cloud. But the box around the H1 and also the paragraph element, they're as long as the width of the page. So what's going on here? Well, by default, some elements are what's called block display. For example, this H1 and this paragraph tag. And block elements are those that take up essentially the whole width of the screen on a web page. So effectively blocking out any other elements from sitting next to it on the left or on the right. Now, the most common block elements that we would have seen already are our paragraphs, our headers, so H1 through to H6, our divs, our lists and list items, as well as forms. And if we head over to CodePen, and I'm just going to create a new anonymous pen. Let me just get rid of the JS editor, and I'm going to have my view with my editors on the right. So now I'm going to go ahead and create 2 block elements. So we know that paragraphs are block elements. So let's create a paragraph called hello, another one called world. Now, if I select the paragraph tag in my CSS and I give them both a background color of, say, red, then you can see that the entire paragraph takes up the whole width of the web page. So it's blocking any other element from being on the same line next to it on the right or on the left. Now, here's a related problem. Say if I wanted to look at this paragraph tag, which we now know to be a block element. What if I wanted to style the pro part of it differently from the rest of the words in this paragraph tag? How can I only target one part of this paragraph tag? How can I say, for example, underline the word pro so that it says a programmer, but style these 3 characters differently? Well, some of you might think that I could just split up this sentence into 3 paragraph tags. So what if it was A plus a space, then it was pro, and then it was grammar. A programmer. So now I've got this separate paragraph tag for the word pro, and I can give it a class of, say, just the word pro, and I can go into styles and style it differently from the others. So I can say .pro, and this one, if you do a little bit of research on Google, you'll find that in order to make it underlined, you just have to change the text decoration to underline. Now, what happens in this case? Let's check it out. You can see that because the paragraph element are blocking elements, they take up the entire width and they block everything else from being on the same line as themselves. This doesn't actually work. Even though we've been able to target just one part of that line, we can't have it looking like this. So let me show you the solution. Instead of having 3 paragraph tags, so let's just undo this to where we were before. We've got a single paragraph element. What we can do is we can use another HTML element called a span. And inside the span, we can add that word pro, and we can give that span a class of pro. And because we've already selected that class in CSS and we're making that part underlined, then that is going to be applied to the word in this span. Now, if we hit save and we refresh, you can see that we've achieved what we set out to do. And this sentence is still on the same line. Now, why is that? If we switch on pesticide once more, and I hold down the control key, you can see that over here, I'm hovering over the entire paragraph element. But one part of it has a span, and this allows us to select, almost like as if you would highlight a section of your text. Just select one part of the text in order to format it or style it differently. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this here instead of inside the HTML module is because spans like divs don't do very much unless they're used in conjunction with CSS. But another reason why I'm showing it to you now is because the span element is what's known as an inline display element. So unlike block display elements, for example, the heading and also the paragraph element, an inline display element only takes up as much space as it needs to in the height and in its width. So you can see that the box around the span is only as large as it needs to be, as is the box around our cloud and also our mountain. So some of the common inline elements that you're going to come across are things like spans, image elements, and also your anchor tags. If you think back to our CV website that we created in our HTML module, the links for our hobbies website and our contact me website, they show up next to each other. And this is because they are inline elements and they do not block other elements from occurring on the same line. In fact, they encourage them to. And so this is why they're called inline elements. Now, if we head back into our code pen and we create another span. Now, while you can have spans that are nested inside paragraph tags or H1s or whatever else it may be, you can also have them as standalones. But you can see here, if we select our span element and we also give it a background color, then you can see that these elements are in line. And even if we had a whole bunch more of these spans, they would continue to be stacked onto the same line until we run out of space horizontally. Now, you might wonder, why would we ever use block elements if we can simply use inline elements? Surely it seems far more flexible. Well, there's just one problem. With inline elements, you can't actually change the width. So if I said the width of all the spans should be 100 pixels, you can see that absolutely nothing happens. But if I specify a width, the same width, to our block elements, then you can see that it complies very eagerly. But it still doesn't let any other element sit on the same line. So what can you do? Well, you can actually change the display property of any given element. So I can make a paragraph element, which we know is by default a block element. I can change its display value to inline. And that makes all of our paragraphs inline elements and allows everything to sit next to each other on the same line. But you can see we've just lost the ability to change its width. Now, similarly, I can change the display property of our inline elements to block elements. And this allows me to change its width, but it doesn't let them sit on the same line. So what should I do if I wanted elements that can occupy the same line, but at the same time I can set their widths? Which one should I choose then? Well, you don't actually have to choose, because there is another type of display, which is called the inline block. And this kind of gives you the best of both worlds. So if instead of changing the paragraph element to inline, I'm going to change it to inline dash block, then you'll see that not only am I allowed to change its width, you can see that it's now 100 pixels wide, but I'm also able to make them go onto the same line. So act almost like inline elements. And this is kind of what image elements are like by default. Now, I say kind of because, as always, reality is much more complex than that. But if you're interested, I'll provide a link to more discussion around this. But for our purposes, we're just going to treat images as if they are inline block elements, because we're able to change its width and height to whatever it is that we desire, and they also get displayed as if they're inline elements next to each other. So we've now covered 3 out of the 4 display values that we have access to. The last one is simply display none, and that just gets rid of our element. So let's head back into our code pen, and I'm going to give our second paragraph element a separate class. I'm going to call this second P, and I'm going to target it down here, dot second P, and I'm going to set its display value to none. And you can see what that does is that it simply removes that element from the website as if it didn't exist. So if I get rid of this display block and allow our spans to continue being inline elements, you can see that there's no gap between the first hello and the second hello. That world paragraph has now completely disappeared out of the flow of the document, as if it never was written inside the code. It's almost like I've just gone ahead and deleted it from the HTML. But of course I haven't. And all that I've done is just set its display value to none. Now, when you're trying to figure out how to hide things on your web page, for example, if you had a quiz, then you might want to hide and show the answer. There's 2 ways that you can do this. One is display none, as you've seen here, which takes that element out of the flow and it's as if it never existed. The other one is a property called visibility. And this you can set to hidden. And what this does is that it makes that element disappear, but it keeps its original position and all the other elements still flow around it as if it's still there. It just can't be seen anymore. So whenever you're trying to make things disappear or reappear, think about what effect you want to have and choose between these 2 properties. So as we've seen in this lesson, the position of elements on screen are determined by many things. The box model, the margins, the size of the border, the size of the width and the height of the actual element, whether if it's display block or whether if it's display inline, whether if we're allowed to set its width or if we're not, But even before CSS comes into play, you have to remember that there's already rules that govern how your HTML elements should be displayed on screen. So to learn about that and to learn more about CSS positioning, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we could change the display property using CSS in order to change the way that our elements stacked against each other. Now, in this lesson, we're going to explore CSS positioning in more detail. But before we do so, the first thing we have to realize is that even without CSS, your HTML element already has predefined rules for how it should be displayed on your web page, even if you don't have any CSS. And we have to understand how things get positioned by default before we can go on to change it, to bend it to our will without getting confused and getting stuck. So let's take a look at these rules. So let's go through those rules quickly. The first rule is that content is everything. Now we know that inline elements only take up as much width and as much height as the content. So if you have a span that contains a long word, then it has a large width. If you have a span that contains a short word, then it has a short width. And with block elements, even though they take up 100% of the width, the height is still determined by the content. So if you have a really super large font for your H1 or for your paragraph, then that box model is going to take up a lot more height than if it was a smaller font. So your content is the first thing that determines how large things gets displayed and what the height and the width will be. And this is despite any CSS. The next thing to remember is that the order of your elements on screen comes from your HTML code. So in this case, we have an H1, 3 paragraphs, then an image. This is how we've written our code in our HTML file. And this is how it gets rendered in that order. Now, if we change the order and put the image at the top of our code file, then our website is going to display in a corresponding way. So the default layout order is determined by your code. The third thing we need to know is that children sit on top of parents. What do I mean by that? So here on the left, I've got a div that's colored in red. Now, if inside this div, I add an H1 with some text, then that H1 is going to be on top of the div. So it's more towards the viewer and away from the screen. So this kind of introduces the concept of the Z index. We know that on screen we have an X and a Y axis, but there's also a Z axis, and that determines which element will be displayed on the other one. Because if in this case the div was in front of the H1, then we wouldn't see the H1 at all. So by default, all HTML elements that are children, they will sit on top of the parent element. So if we modify this code even further and we add a span nested inside that H1, then the word inside the span is going to be on top of the H1. So we have 3 elements here on screen so far, a div, an H1, and a span. And going from the screen towards the viewer, we first have the div, then the H1, then the span. From top to the bottom of the hierarchy, it comes closer and closer towards the viewer. So these 3 are the default rules for how things get rendered on screen, just based on your HTML code. Now, you can also set a CSS property, which is the position property, in order to position elements on screen the way that you want it to, instead of just going along with the default layout. And in most cases, you're going to want to make changes to the default layout. So let's look at some of the ways in which we can change this position property. Now, these are the 4 that I'm going to talk about. And the first one, the static position, we've actually already talked about it. All HTML elements are static in their position by default. And static just means go along with the HTML rules and keep to the default HTML flow. And that is what we see when we just have HTML without any CSS, or if we don't change this position property at all. Now, the next one is called the relative positioning. And what this allows us to do is to position the element that we select relative to how it would have been positioned had it been static. So in this case, on the left, we've got our bacon fan site, and this is just the normal HTML flow. The image is being shown to the left, and it's below all the other elements, abiding by those 3 rules for HTML flow that we mentioned before. Now, if we select that image element and we change its position property to relative instead of static, which is the default, remember, and in addition to that, we say it should be pushed 30 pixels from the left of the previous position. This is how our image will end up being positioned. So whereas the left edge of our image used to be here, and that would have been its natural position, abiding by the HTML flow, now we're saying give that image 30 pixels of space between its left edge and where the left edge used to be. And there's 4 of these coordinate properties: the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. And we can set values for them in order to determine how we want to move our element. So let's say that we've got an image that is positioned using relative layout. Then we set the top coordinate property to 20 pixels. That means it will get moved down by 20 pixels. And if we change the left property 20 pixels, then it'll get pushed right 20 pixels. If we change the right property 20 pixels, it'll get pushed left 20 pixels, and the bottom property as well. Now, there's 2 important things that you have to remember when you're dealing with relative positioning. The first thing is that when you move an element that has a relative position, say in this case we're pushing it down by 50 pixels, it doesn't affect the position of anything else on screen. It's as if the old position was kept and everything else just flows around it as if it was never moved. It's almost like this element left the ghost of itself where it used to be in order for all the other elements to keep their own positions. Now, the other thing to remember is that when we change the coordinate properties, for example, in this case, we're saying make the top coordinate property for this relatively positioned image 50 pixels. What that really means is that we're taking the top of where that image used to be and we're giving it a 50 pixel margin from the top of our current image. So if you think back to the box model, when we spoke about margins, this is the best way of thinking about these coordinates, because very often students tend to ask, if it's top 50, why is it not going up by 50? And why is it instead going down? And what is it top relative to? So if you get confused, have a look back at this video. So inside this code pen, I've created 3 divs that are colored red, blue, and yellow. And they each have a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels. So essentially 3 squares inside a body element. I want to show you what changing the red div's position from static, which it currently is by default, to relative does. Now, by itself, changing this position property does nothing. It only starts doing something when you use one of the coordinate properties like left. So let's push it 20 pixels from the left. You can see that it just got nudged 20 pixels from the left of where it used to be. Now, I can also move it all the way to the right by saying something like left 600 pixels. So it's now got a margin between the left edge of where it used to be and the current left edge of 600 pixels. Now, if I say right 200 pixels. Can you predict what will happen to my red square? So let's take a look, see if you got it right. So our red square has completely disappeared off the screen. Now, why is that? Well, because the previous right edge was here. And to have a margin between the current right edge and the previous right edge of 200 pixels pushes our red square all the way over to the left that you can't see it anymore. Now, some people might have thought that by saying right 200 pixels, then it should be somewhere around here because this is the right edge of the screen. But as we mentioned, the relative positioning is relative to where the element would have been displayed if it was just following the natural HTML flow. So it would have been here. And now there's a margin between its previous right edge and its current right edge of 200 pixels. But remember, as we said, that the relative positioning doesn't affect any other element on screen. So if I said top 50 pixels, it pushes it down by 50 pixels, but it doesn't affect the layout of any other element on screen. It doesn't, for example, push this blue square downwards or any other element. It's as if the ghost of the red square's past has stayed where it used to be, and it's only this newer version that's being moved around. So there's a lot of new concepts here, and before we move on, I just want to make sure that you're comfortable with this idea of relative positioning. So as a challenge, I want you to change the display property of the blue and the yellow squares so that they will show up in a row where we've got the red square, the blue square, and the yellow square. And then I want you to move the red square to the right of the yellow square. And this is what you should end up with. Now, don't worry too much about the gaps between the squares. It's more important that you get the order right. So they're all on the same line, and it's blue, then yellow, then red. And you should be able to see most of the square. All right, so did you manage to do it? So the first thing that we needed to change was the display property of all three elements. So we're going to change it to inline block so that we can still change its width, but also have them show up in line. So let's add that line of code to all three divs. So now they're in the same line. So I want to get rid of this top and make them line up properly. But I now want to nudge the blue square to the position of the red square. So I'm going to make its position relative to where it should be, and I'm going to give it a right margin of 100 pixels. And I'm going to do the same thing to our yellow square. So I'm going to change its position to relative and also give it a right margin from its previous position to 100 pixels. And that nudges it left. Now, the final thing I have to do is to move the red square to the right by 200 pixels. So I can change its left margin to 200 pixels, and that moves the red square over to the right. Now, the reason why the spaces between our squares are inconsistent is because by making it an inline block, there's actually a little bit of space that gets added in by the browser. So we can see that if we get rid of all the position code, there's just a slight smudge of a space between each of the inline block elements. And that's what's making our gaps slightly inconsistent. But the important thing is that you manage to get the order of the blocks correct. So if you manage to get the squares to line up in this order, then that means you've successfully completed the challenge. In order to get the position more fine-tuned, we're going to look at different ways in the future. Now, in the next lesson, I want to show you another way of positioning your elements by using absolute positions. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.